Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm honored to be here today on behalf of Josh Minkler, who is the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Indiana, and I'm honored to be here with my esteemed colleagues on the stage with me, particularly Mr. Bergeron, who I've worked with from the Department of Justice several times. At this point, I have to tell you that my comments today are my own personal opinions and not those necessarily held by the Department of Justice. But with that in mind, I also want to let you know that, as it was said in my introduction, that I am your local contact for federal law enforcement. I have lived and worked and worshiped in the Indianapolis community for the last 25 years, so I'm excited to be here with you and to broaden my knowledge of the Indianapolis community and to help in the ways that I can as an Assistant United States Attorney. This is a great opportunity to share information about hate crimes and incidences and to talk about what we can do about these things. The federal government shares in your struggle to try to maintain your house of worship safely and your home safely. We do this in our hope. Our hopes are that we can do this through education, increased awareness of hate-based crimes and incidences, and also through the prosecution and investigation of hate-based crimes. So a little bit about our office, in case sometimes the United States Attorney's Office gets confused with the Indiana Attorney General's Office. The United States Attorney's Office is the chief federal prosecution office in Indiana. And so our mission is to prosecute violations of federal statutes, both criminal and civil. Our office, the Southern District of Indiana, encompasses the 60 southernmost counties in Indiana. So think Kokomo on down, and that is where the Southern District of Indiana lies. Our main office is in Indianapolis, but we also file cases and have branches in New Albany, Terre Haute, and in Evansville. We work on these federal and violations of civil and criminal crimes, and our mission is also to represent the United States when they are sued in a case as well. And our third mission, can you hear me okay? I'm sorry, I just realized that my microphone didn't. Okay. Thirdly, our mission is to work on crime prevention, such as this, by trying to assume leadership roles in community involvement. As an Assistant United States Attorney, I work with the Department of Justice in enforcing the federal statutes, and we do investigations and prosecutions into human trafficking, the excessive use of force by law enforcement or in prison. Other cases that we work on are preserving the right to vote, protecting students and employees against discrimination, harassment, retaliation, protecting the rights of persons with disabilities to equal access to public accommodations and services, upholding the rights of persons in public institutions, and protecting the rights of religious communities to construct and maintain safe places of worship. How we receive civil rights complaints, in case you're interested, is from many, many, many sources. So we get letters, emails, phone calls, faxes, thousands of them, both to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Indianapolis and also to the Department of Justice. Our website, if you go onto our website, there's a civil rights complaint form right there you can click on and either send via email or fax or through the regular mail. We also receive complaints from agencies, advocacy agencies that represent different groups in the community. And we receive complaints from federal agencies, from the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, HUD, Housing and Urban Development, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigations. And those are all the complaints that we would work on investigating and determining whether charges should be, or cases should be opened. If there's a chance that you have a complaint or an incident that you report and we are unable to open an investigation on that case, the Department of Justice, United States Attorneys, our first response is usually to look to another federal agency that can help you. We say, where else can we send this person for help? Or sometimes refer you then to a local government official or a private attorney if that's necessary. Combating hate crimes is a high priority for both the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And there's three reasons why hate crimes are such a top priority. First, as we all know, hate crimes are particularly malicious because they are meant to intimidate and terrorize whole communities. And so, for example, there are a couple of, I wanted to talk a little bit about what our responses have been in some of these situations. So just this fall, the Department of Justice prosecuted a man who left a phone message threatening to shoot members of an Islamic temple in Greater Miami in Florida, and also prosecuted another man who burned down a mosque in Victoria, Texas. The second reason that hate crimes are such a priority is that the perpetrators use them to deny people, individuals, of their very basic fundamental rights. You know, your right to walk down the street and live your life without interference, your right to equal housing, your right to equal employment, and your other fundamental civil rights. So for example, one of the cases that the Department of Justice took on and successfully prosecuted also this year involved a man in Bakersfield, California, who fired a shotgun toward a Latino family as they just stood in their front yard and yelled to them to move out, and then just drove right down the road and fired on a market that was owned by a Middle Eastern man. The Department of Justice also successfully prosecuted this year a Florida man who threatened 2 Muslim store owners with violence if they did not close their store and move it out of the neighborhood. The last reason why we believe hate crimes are such a priority is because hate crimes are violent crimes in and of themselves. And no effort to combat violent crime, either in our community or in our nation, cannot involve a more specific look at our hate crimes. In June, for example, there was a man indicted for shooting 2 Indian men at a bar in Kansas and killing one because he thought that they were Iranian descent. He's also charged with wounding a bystander who tried to intervene in the shooting. And that's important because that's, Jay talked a little bit about perceived, you know, he thought that they were of Iranian descent, so the law also protects misperceptions by the perpetrator as well. There was a hate crime subcommittee in Washington, D.C. just as late as this June, and they've talked about sort of, you know, they've charged us in our local communities with outreach and education, better data collection, better working with law enforcement, better training for law enforcement. And so those are the things that we're working on. And like Jay said, I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the federal hate crimes laws. I'm going to tell you that this is, I was reviewing my presentation this morning, and this is the point where my 16-year-old daughter went, oh, and just walked out of the room because there's a little legal mumbo-jumbo in there, right? So I'll try to keep it brief, but I can't keep all this in my head, so I do have to read some of the statutory language to you so you'll understand. But as Jay alluded to, hate crimes really involve 2 elements, hate and crime, a criminal action. And so perhaps the one that you hear about the most, and the one that is the federal statute that's most vigorously in the forefront of the news and in prosecution efforts right now, is the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act of 2009. This law makes it a federal crime to willfully cause bodily injury or to attempt to create bodily injury using a dangerous weapon because of the victim's actual or perceived race, color, religion, or national origin. And then the act also extended those federal hate crime protections to crimes that are committed against others because of actual or perceived religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability of any person. However, the caveat for that to reach a federal crime level is that those crimes have to either affect interstate commerce or foreign commerce or occur in a special maritime territorial jurisdiction. There's the mumbo jumbo, right? But suffice to say, why I say that is that there are very specific criteria for crimes to reach the level of crimes that are prosecuted on a federal level. And you'll hear a little more from Ryan, I think, about the difference, or a little, you know, about what that means in terms of Indiana defines crimes differently than the federal law does. And so those are some of the requirements in order to prosecute someone on the federal level under the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Some of the cases I just spoke about were identified as being prosecuted under that act. There are also a few more this year. In May of 2017, a man named Joshua Valum became the first person prosecuted under the Hate Crime Prevention Act for an act involving a victim who was targeted because of his gender identity. He was sentenced to 49 years in prison for assaulting and murdering a transgender woman in southern Mississippi. In the same month, in May of 2017, 4 Texas men were indicted on 18 counts of conspiring to commit bodily harm to people because of their sexual orientation. And these men were using social media to identify gay men and then going to their homes and assaulting and terrorizing them, all because of their orientation. The next criminal hate crime I'd like to address is called criminal interference with the fair right to housing. This statute makes it a crime to use or to threaten to use force, so again, you need that force element, to interfere with housing rights because of a victim's race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, or national origin. Here's an example of a case that the federal government prosecuted under that statute. In April of 2017, a Florida man pleaded guilty in Tampa to conspiring with other people to threaten, intimidate, and interfere with an interracial couple's enjoyment of their housing rights. So according to the court documents in that case, this man was living in a predominantly white community. When an interracial couple moved next door, he joined other neighbors in harassing, racial slurs, derogatory comments toward this couple, which culminated on Halloween night with the neighbors and this man who has since pled guilty, and some of the other co-conspirators are also, their cases are pending. But they went to this couple's house and burned a 6-foot-tall cross on their front lawn, and they were prosecuted under this criminal statute. Another statute that you might be interested here is the Damage to Religious Property, the Church Arson Prevention Act. This statute prohibits the intentional defacement, damage, or destruction of religious real property because of a religious nature of a property, where the crime, again, affects interstate or foreign commerce. And again, these are crimes based on race, color, ethnic characteristics of the person associated with the property. This statute also makes it criminal the intentional obstruction by force or threat of force of any person's enjoyment of their free exercise of religious beliefs. The last criminal hate crime statute I'd just like to review with you briefly is violent interference with federally protected rights. And this is a statute that makes it a crime to use force or to threaten to use force, willfully interfere with any person because of race, color, religion, or national origin, if that person is participating in a federally protected activity. Some examples of federally protected activity is attending a public school or college, participating in a service or a program, applying for or enjoying state employment, private employment, traveling, patronizing a place of public accommodations. So those are just some of the federal hate crimes laws, and I encourage you, if you're interested in more of this information, you can go on the Department of Justice website as well, and all of the laws are outlined, as well as all of the cases that the Department of Justice has taken on and prosecuted in those areas. Additionally, along with the criminal statutes, as a federal prosecutor, I work on cases that involve civil laws and violations of those civil laws. Primarily in those areas, that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prevents or prohibits discrimination against persons with disabilities in places of public accommodation in state and local government and facilities. I've also worked on cases involving fair housing and fair lending and the Voting Act, and there's several different voting acts as well. So that's just a brief overview because I want you to be able to hear from everybody. I look forward to working with you in this community again. I'm very interested in doing other initiatives that we have, such as talking to folks in the school about religious discrimination and teaching students about knowing their rights. But for now, let me just say thank you for letting me be part of this panel. And again, on behalf of Josh Minkler, thanks for your time.